Before they were airlifted and flown to Kenya, the couple met their Good Samaritan once again and thanked him endlessly for the kindness that he showed to them. They took his address and promised to keep in touch. Though it was only 1 month's friendship, the couple felt as if they had known the good man from the time of their births. He checked on them daily, and many a time he brought outside food and drinks for them. He brought his wife Nina and introduced her personally to them. He also brought to them clothes and other needed items such as blankets and bed sheets. He supplied them with some insecticides to keep the bugs at bay and made their stay in the refugee camp as tolerable as possible. He told them that, if he could, he would have taken them to live with him and his wife in the hotel. Up until the day the couple boarded a small UN plane with other refugees and flew from south of Sudan and toward Kenya, they had not gotten any definitive answers to their applications at the American embassy. They had exited one African country as refugees in favor of another. They were simply being transferred from one refugees camp to another. As it is with all refugee camps, this was to be their permanent residence until they were granted asylum in another host country. Their movements were restricted and confined within the camp. If they ventured out and were apprehended by the Kenyan police, they would be treated as illegal aliens. In that case, they would be jailed for some time and then returned to their camp. During that time, they would be exposed to all kinds of abuse by the corrupt African police. Some Somali refugee girls suffered rape while their male counterparts died at the hands of the Kenyan policemen. Many refugees ended up living in the camps for years, living out the remainder of their years in them. Some were born and raised up in the camps, knowing no other life, like criminals serving life terms. Their situations were similar to the Palestinian refugees who lived for over a half-century as refugees in refugee camps of Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. In 1967, the Allied armies of 5 Arab countries told the Muslim Palestinians to flee out of Israel to avoid being killed by friendly fire, a result of their combined attacks against the so-called Zionist state to annihilate all the Jews. Over 500,000 Palestinians trusted their Arab friends and fled to Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. In the Six-Day War, the IDF defeated the combined Arab armies of over 1 million soldiers. Those Palestinians, who placed their trust in the hands of the Jews, remain in their homes in Israel until today, while those believed the Arabs became perpetual refugees in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Their children were born in the refugees camps, and they in turn grew to have their own children in the very same camps. The Arabs never granted them citizenship simply because they were far more valuable as stateless citizens in their propaganda war. They now number in the millions. Majority of them were Jordanians who became Palestinians overnight. They want Israel to allow them to return to Palestine when most of them are not Palestinians. In 1967, 500,000 Palestinians fled, but today 9.6 million Arabs claim to be Palestinians and demand the right of return. Even chicken and dogs don't reproduce and multiply that fast. If any one of them managed to escape from those perpetual refugee camps to make his way to a Western country, in 3 years or so he will be granted the citizenship of that country. But, if he managed somehow to smuggle himself into a rich Arab country, which is second to impossible, he will be treated as a parasite and an intruder and get harassed constantly by the police of that country. No matter how long he lives in that Arab country, he will never become citizen. The only option left to him is to stay, live, breed and die as a refugee. This is an obvious violation of human rights, one which the UN has never passed a resolution against. Today Jordan or Lebanon or Syria steadfastly refuses to grant citizenship statuses to those Palestinian refugees and their children who are living as refugees since 1967. Some of them are third-generation refugees, since the first 2 Arab-Israeli wars of 1948 and 1949. There are millions of Syrians, Iraqis, and Somalis refugees waiting to be resettled in Western countries. For instance, there are over 1 million Somali refugees in Kenya awaiting resettlement in Western countries. After the recent Somali terrorist attack at a university in Kenya which resulted in the murder of 147 innocent Kenyan students, the Kenyan government is determined to send them all back to Somalia. It gave the UN a deadline to vacate its camps, or otherwise the Kenyan authorities would literally kick them off Kenyan soil. If this conflict is not resolved speedily, we are bound to see all Western airports crowded with Somali refugees coming to their new homes for resettlements. Big Mama, USA, would be pressurized on humanitarian grounds to accept the majority of them. In this regards, an American citizen, Maggie states, over 7 years ago, a church group, from another state, brought a large number of refugees to the rural area where Ann Corcoran lives. She then explains the federal agency's involvement in populating the U.S. with Muslims charged by their holy book to spread Islam throughout the world. Some of our churches are making this repopulation their mission, with the help of the United Nations. Ann Corcoran writes, I discovered that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was choosing most of our refugees. It's under the influence of the powerful Muslim group, the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. Not surprisingly, a large number of US-bound refugees are coming from countries with large numbers of people who hate us, including Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq and Syria, just to name a few. The U.S. State Department then distributes the refugees to 9 major federal contractors, 6 of which are so-called charities, but all are largely funded from the U.S. Treasury. They are not passing the plate on Sundays for the $1 billion price tag for the resettlement, and that figure doesn't include the extensive welfare benefits refugees receive. The refugees are then sent to over 190 cities in the U.S. where the 9 major contractors support 350 subcontractors. The refugees receive help from the subcontractor for up to 6 months, and the subcontractor then submits paperwork to admit the relatives of the first group. As the years have passed, I have become increasingly alarmed by the percentage of problematic Muslim refugees admitted and distributed around the U.S. through this program. By the way, the refugee resettlement program is not the only one used for legally admitting Muslims, but it is one of the most important. Many are forming cities within cities. Perhaps you know one where you live, where mosques are being built to consolidate, train and promote a growing American Muslim population, and its Islamic supremacist doctrine, called Sharia. This process of Muslim colonization is called the Hijra, the holy migration. Muhammad told his followers to migrate and spread Islam in order to dominate all the lands of the world. He said, you are obliged to do so, and that is exactly what they are doing now with the help and support of the UN, the U.S. State Department and the Christian and Jewish groups assigned to seed them throughout the country. Your tax dollars pay for it all. We only need to look to a troubled Europe to see the path ahead for America, if we can't stop this migration, and stop it soon. There is no reason on earth that we should have brought over 100,000 Somalis, and another 100,000 Iraqi Muslims to America. Soon we will be resettling Syrian Muslims in large numbers. The UN, at the moment, has over 10,000 in a pipeline destined for our towns. The FBI told Congress recently that they cannot be properly screened. If you don't help counter the Hijra, we are, in my opinion, doomed. Over time, this migration will be more devastating to your children and grandchildren and to our country than any terrorist attack that could ever be. Why Muslim refugees always need to be sent to the Western countries and not to the rich Muslim countries. Why the burden of conscience has to be laid on the backs of the infidels and not the Muslims. Who made the Muslim Somalis, Iraqis, Syrians, Yemenis, Libyans, Egyptians, Afghanis, Pakistanis, Nigerians, and Sudanese to carry arms and plague their countries with bloody religious wars which resulted in the death of thousands and displacement of millions? Of course, the main cause is the hostile teachings of their Quran and the Sunnah of their Prophet. In any case, the waiting list for resettlement in Western countries can take long time. The Somali refugee camps in Kenya were established 20 years ago. Understandably, many young refugees prefer to run off and face untold dangers rather than live and die in the camps. Some drown in the Mediterranean on their way to Europe. Some forge documents and fly to Europe, only to be arrested at the airports. As is normally the case, these particular detainees would be treated as refugees and be considered the responsibility of the UN. The UN then would twist the arms of the host country and encourage the granting of permanent resident status, which eventually end up in them being the citizens of that country. Citizens on papers, but in hearts their loyalty to their religion and country of origin will never die or waver. All Muslims of the world without a single exception believe that they are citizens of the Islamic Caliphate, which its leader is Prophet Muhammad and its capital city is Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Most European countries try to avoid the cost of taking care of those countless numbers of Muslim refugees and the cost of their air return. The unceasing Muslim terrorist attacks on their innocent citizens is the driving force which leads those European countries to get rid of the refugees and send them across the Atlantic. In addition, majority of those illegal immigrants claim imminent mortal danger if they are sent home. Of course, the other alternative would be to send those poor refugees and their many children to the Big Mama, the United States of America. When the same refugees are resettled, well-fed, and educated, they will breed and multiply. Their children might become homegrown terrorists. Then, the Big Mama who adopted them and reared them in love and care along with her infidel children would become the great Satan who needs to be destroyed. The crucial problem simply this, that Muslim refugees with Islamic backgrounds can find integration into Western society insurmountable, where they seem to oppose everything Islamic. Muslims hold as sacred and as a right the concepts of halal food, the burqa, the Islamic education provided by the madrasas, religious schools and mosques, the sanctity of marriage, the status of woman according to the Sharia, child marriage, wife beating, female genital mutilation, polygamy, the compulsory 5 prayers, the times of prayers, the use of washrooms, the societal views of infidels as inferiors and enemies, jihad for spreading Islam among infidels, the concept of right and wrong, halal and haram, etc., etc., etc. Those religious obligations and restrictions and many more make it impossible for true Muslims to be loyal to their religion and at the same time to integrate into Western society. In order to prove the above point, let us refer to the case of an Australian jihadist who carried out a suicide mission for ISIS. On March 23, 2015, an article in AFP mentioned that an Australian schoolboy, an 18-year-old teenager from Melbourne named Jake Bylardy, died while completing his suicide bombing mission for the Islamic State, also called ISIS. The writer says Jake developed a complete hatred and opposition to the entire Australian system and the ones the majority of the world are based upon. A blog widely attributed to Jake Bylardy explains the teen's switch from suburban schoolboy in comfortable Melbourne to violent jihadist ready to sacrifice his life for the cause. In an interview, his father, John Bylardy, says, "He was recruited online and I knew nothing of this. I knew nothing of his radicalization. The changes that Islam can bring all of a sudden in the life of its true and sincere followers can hardly be grasped or understood by the mind of a person who is not part of it. Sincerely following the teachings of Islam can change the person and turn him into a hater of anything and anyone who is non-Islamic." This is well expressed by the father of the very same Australian jihadist who blew himself up in the cause of Islam. "I just couldn't believe it was my son. It's hard to process this. But that wasn't him. He was just a shy, lonely young man. How he got to this I cannot even start to try and explain." The words of this father explain so well the complete change that Islamic teachings can effect in the life of the one who follows it. In short, it created in the life of his son, complete hatred and opposition to the entire Australian system, Western society, and that which the majority of the world was based upon. Islam also uses another very powerful incentive to draw the youth and convince them to die for its cause. This incentive can attract many youth because all young boys and girls love it the most. It is more powerful than alcohol and drugs. It is the incentive of free sex and a lot of it. A Muslim jihadist knows that as soon as he reaches Syria, he will be wedded with 1 to 4 underage girls, girls as young as 9 to 12. In addition to his 4 young wives, he can have sex, rape, with many women of those defeated Syrian and Iraqi soldiers, Christians and Yazids, who are considered by the Quran as right-hand possessed or war female slaves, Quran, Surah 4, verse 3. The jihadist also is encouraged to die as Shaheed martyr and go to paradise to enjoy the 72 sublime female virgins who are million times more beautiful than the women of this earth. This tempting promise makes Muslim youth love death and hate life.